The morning crept in quietly, a thin band of light slipping through the cracked blinds of Evan's apartment. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving behind a hushed, heavy calm. The city outside was just waking. Distant car engines, a barking dog, a delivery truck rumbling past. Clara Hale opened her eyes to the faint sound of movement in the kitchen. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The couch beneath her was old but soft, and the scent of brewed coffee drifted through the air. Then she saw the blanket around her shoulders, the dried towel beside her, and the bandaged ankle resting on a cushion. Memory returned all at once. The alley, the fear, the stranger's voice cutting through the storm. She sat up too quickly, wincing at the pull in her leg. Across the small living room, Evan was standing by the stove, wearing an old grey t-shirt, his hair damp from a recent shower. He was stirring something in a pot, his movements slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't be up yet," he said when he noticed her watching. Clara's voice was hoarse. "Where am I?" "My place," he answered. "You passed out last night. I didn't know where else to take you." She looked around, taking in the mismatched furniture, the tiny table with a chipped edge, the walls covered in children's drawings, stick figures holding hands beneath uneven rainbows. It was a world so far removed from hers that it almost didn't feel real. Evan nodded toward the couch. "You should rest. I'll get you some breakfast." "I can't stay here," Clara said softly. "You've done enough." "You can't walk," he replied, keeping his tone steady. "At least not yet." From the hallway, small footsteps echoed. The little girl appeared, still wearing her yellow raincoat from the night before. Her curls framed her face in messy spirals, and she was holding her stuffed rabbit by the ear. "Daddy?" she said sleepily. "Is the lady awake?" "She is," Evan said, glancing down with a faint smile. "Come say hi, Rosie." The child hesitated before walking closer. She stopped a few feet from the couch and stared at Clara with cautious curiosity. "You were crying yesterday," she said simply. Clara swallowed hard. "I was scared." "Why?" Rosie asked. Evan interrupted gently. "That's enough questions, honey." But Clara shook her head. "It's all right, I guess. I forgot what it felt like to be safe." Rosie nodded as if she understood more than she should have. "When I miss my mummy, I cry too," she said. "Daddy says it's okay to cry if your heart hurts." Clara's throat tightened. She looked at Evan, who was quietly watching from the kitchen doorway, a trace of pain crossing his face. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. "I didn't mean to—" "It's fine," he said before she could finish. "She doesn't remember much about her mom. Talking helps her." Rosie climbed onto the rug and began unpacking a small box of crayons. She laid them out in neat rows and started to draw on a torn sheet of printer paper. Evan brought over a mug of tea. "Drink this," he said. "Ginger and honey. It'll help your throat." Clara nodded and took a cautious sip. "You made this yourself?" "Old habit," he said. "I used to work as a medic. Learned a few things about keeping people together." "Even strangers?" she asked quietly. He looked at her for a moment before replying, "Especially strangers." The room fell into a gentle silence, broken only by the sound of crayons moving across paper. The morning light grew brighter, catching on the dust motes in the air. Clara watched Rosie draw, thick strokes of purple and blue forming a scene she couldn't yet make out. After a while, Evan crouched beside his daughter. "What are you making this time?" he asked. Rosie smiled without looking up. "A family picture, you, me, and—" She paused, glancing toward Clara. "And her." Clara blinked. "Me?" "Yeah," the child said matter-of-factly. "There's always been an empty space next to Daddy. I think maybe it was waiting for someone." Evan exhaled softly. "Rosie," he said gently, "you can't just—" "But look," she interrupted, holding up the picture. The drawing was uneven but full of color. A tall man, a little girl in yellow shoes, and a figure outlined beside them, the face left blank. Clara stared at it, her chest tightening. She tried to speak, but couldn't. The simple drawing hit her harder than any speech could have. "Thank you," she managed to say finally. "It's beautiful." Rosie grinned proudly and went back to coloring. Evan stood, running a hand through his hair. She gets attached easily, he said quietly. I understand, Clara replied. So do I. For the rest of the morning, the apartment was filled with the quiet rhythm of ordinary life, the clatter of dishes, the scratch of crayons, the faint hum of a radio playing somewhere in another apartment. For someone who had spent years surrounded by noise, ambition, and performance, Clara found the simplicity disarming. She leaned back, sipping the last of her tea, and whispered almost to herself, "It's so peaceful here." Evan heard her but didn't respond. He was at the sink washing a few dishes, lost in thought. Later, when Rosie went to her room for a nap, Clara tried to stand. Pain shot through her ankle again. Evan was at her side instantly, steadying her arm. "Easy," he said. "You'll make it worse." "I can't stay," she said again, frustration edging her voice. "I don't belong here." "You don't belong out there either," he replied flatly. "Not until you can walk." She looked at him, searching for anger or pity in his tone, but found neither. There was only calm certainty, the same steady presence that had stopped Victor in the alley. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You don't even know me." He met her eyes. "I know what fear looks like. That's enough." Her grip tightened on his arm for a second, then she let go and sat back down. By late afternoon, the light had softened into gold. Evan fixed a simple dinner, soup and toast, and left a small tray by her side before tucking Rosie into bed. When he returned, Clara was staring out the window, watching the city lights blur against the glass. "You should sleep," he said. She nodded, but didn't move. "I keep thinking about last night, about him finding me." Evan leaned against the doorway. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" She hesitated. "Not yet." "Then don't," he said. "You don't owe me an explanation." Clara turned to look at him. "You really don't expect anything from me, do you?" He shook his head. "No one should have to earn kindness." The words landed softly, almost like a benediction. Later that night, after Evan turned off the lights, Clara lay awake, listening to the sound of rain starting again against the window. She thought of the alley, the voice that saved her, and the child who had drawn her into a family she didn't deserve. On the coffee table lay the picture Rosie had made. Clara reached for it, tracing the unfinished outline with her finger. Maybe, she thought, the empty space wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was an invitation. Rain fell in sheets over the narrow alley, turning the cracked pavement into a mirror of trembling reflections. Neon signs flickered somewhere above, their colors bleeding into puddles that rippled with every drop. A woman's voice cut through the night, thin, broken, desperate. "Please don't hurt me. I can't walk." Her name was Clara Hale. Though no one would have recognized her now, the woman who once ruled glass towers and boardrooms was on her knees in the mud, her white suit torn, soaked, and stained with grime. One heel was missing. Her blonde hair clung to her face, strands plastered to tear-streaked cheeks. She tried to crawl backward, but pain shot through her left leg. Her ankle was twisted at a cruel angle. A man loomed over her, tall and trembling with fury. His breath steamed in the cold air as he stepped closer, his shadow stretching long against the brick walls. "Give it to me, Clara," he growled, voice low but shaking with rage. "You think you can just take what's mine and run?" She clutched the small laptop against her chest like it was a lifeline. "It's over, Victor. I'm done doing your bidding." "You're not done until I say you are." He reached for her wrist. She flinched, curling up tighter. The rain kept falling, washing the dirt into thin rivers beneath her. Then footsteps. From around the corner, a figure appeared, carrying a small girl wrapped in a yellow raincoat. His clothes were wet, his boots heavy with mud, and his face shadowed by exhaustion. The man's name was Evan Brooks, a single father and former paramedic who had seen too much of life's cruelty to be surprised by another scream. He stopped when he heard Clara's voice echoing off the alley walls. The child in his arms stirred. "Daddy, is she going to die?" she whispered. "Stay here," Evan said softly. He set her down beneath the awning of a closed shop. "Don't move, Rosie." She nodded, clutching her stuffed rabbit to her chest. Evan stepped into the alley. "Hey!" His voice cut through the storm like a warning siren. Step away from her." Victor turned, startled. For a moment, the only sound was the hiss of rain between them. The two men stared at each other, one trembling with aggression, the other steady and unflinching. "You don't know who I am," Victor said, his voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "I don't need to," Evan replied. "I know what kind of man corners someone who's already down." Victor took a step forward. "Mind your business." It became my business when I heard her beg. There was no threat in Evan's tone, just quiet certainty. It was the kind of calm that made most men hesitate. Victor's jaw tightened, his fists flexed, but something in Evan's eyes, tired, cold, unwavering, made him falter. After a long moment, Victor took a single step back, then another. His gaze flickered from Evan to Clara. Finally he turned and disappeared into the rain, swallowed by the night. Evan waited, shoulders tense, until the sound of footsteps vanished. Then he moved closer to Clara. "You're safe now," he said quietly. Clara's lips trembled. "Who are you?" "Just someone who couldn't keep walking." Her body shook as he knelt beside her. The rain had turned to a soft drizzle, but she was drenched, shivering violently. When he touched her ankle, she gasped in pain. "It's sprained, maybe broken," he muttered. "We need to get you somewhere warm." "No hospitals," she said quickly. "Please." Evan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, my place isn't far. Can you hold on?" Clara hesitated, then gave a small nod. He slid one arm beneath her knees, the other around her back, and lifted her as though she weighed nothing. She clung to the laptop even as her head dropped weakly against his chest. Rosie appeared at the edge of the alley, her big eyes wide. "Daddy?" "It's okay, sweetheart," Evan said. "We're helping her." The little girl reached out and touched Clara's wet sleeve. "She's crying," she whispered. "She's had a hard night," Evan replied. "Let's get home." They walked through the empty streets in silence. The city's glow reflected off the puddles, and every few steps, the child's boots splashed softly in rhythm. By the time they reached Evan's apartment building, the rain had thinned to a mist. The place was old, bricks faded and cracked, but the small light by the stairwell glowed warmly. He carried Clara up 3 flights, his breath steady despite the weight. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of soap, wood, and coffee. He set her gently on the couch, wrapping an old blanket around her shoulders. "You'll be okay," he said. "I'll find something for your foot." Rosie hovered near the doorway, her rabbit still in hand. "Daddy," she whispered. "She looks like one of the people from the magazines at the store." Evan smiled faintly. "Maybe she used to be. For now she's just someone who needs help." Clara tried to speak but couldn't. Her throat burned with exhaustion and shame. She had spent her life commanding rooms filled with power, and now she could barely form words. Evan returned with a towel and a small first aid kit. His hands were careful, methodical. When he touched her ankle again, she winced but didn't pull away. "Sorry," he said quietly. "It'll hurt for a while." Clara watched him work, his movements calm and precise. No questions, no judgment. Just kindness. When he finished, he stood and moved toward the kitchen. "I'll make some tea." "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked. He paused at the doorway. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it either." The room fell silent, except for the rain tapping at the window. Minutes later, he brought a steaming mug and set it beside her. "Drink, it'll help." She lifted it with trembling hands, the warmth seeping into her fingers. Across the room, Rosie was sitting cross-legged on the floor, drawing with a box of worn crayons. She looked up and smiled shyly at Clara before returning to her sketch. Clara stared into the cup, trying to steady her breathing. For years, she had fought to prove she belonged among wolves. Tonight, for the first time, she wondered what it would feel like to just stop running. Outside, thunder rolled again, but inside the air was still, quiet enough for her to hear her own heartbeat. When Evan covered her with another blanket and turned off the lamp, her eyes were already closing. For the first time in years, Clara Hale didn't dream of boardrooms or contracts or headlines. She dreamed of rain, of a stranger's calm voice in the dark, and of a child's small hand offering comfort without asking anything in return. And though she didn't know it yet, That moment in the rain would be the night her life quietly began again. Morning sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, scattering soft streaks of gold across the small apartment. The air smelled faintly of coffee and toasted bread. From the kitchen came the gentle clatter of pans and the low hum of a man humming without realizing he was doing it. Clara Hale woke slowly this time, her ankles stiff but less swollen. The blanket had slipped halfway off during the night, and the pillow beneath her head smelled faintly of soap and rain. She blinked at the drawings still taped to the wall. Bright rainbows, stick figures, a cat with 6 legs. Each one signed at the bottom in large, uneven letters, Rosie. A moment later she heard the girl's voice call out from the kitchen. "Daddy, can I give her the picture now?" Evan answered quietly. "Wait until she's awake, sweetheart." "I think she's awake," Rosie said, already padding into the room on small bare feet. Clara smiled faintly as the girl appeared beside the couch, clutching a folded piece of paper to her chest. "Good morning," Clara said. Rosie's curls bounced as she nodded. "Morning. Daddy made pancakes. He burns them sometimes, but I told him that's okay." Clara sat up, suppressing a laugh. "That's very forgiving of you." "I forgive a lot," Rosie said seriously. Then she handed over the paper. "This is for you." Clara unfolded it carefully. It was another drawing, 3 figures standing side by side. The tallest one was clearly Evan, his square shoulders drawn in crayon brown. The smallest was Rosie, her yellow boots drawn with such thick color that the paper was nearly worn through. Between them was a woman with golden hair and a purple dress. Above their heads, in uneven rainbow letters, Rosie had written, "My family." Clara felt her throat close. "Rosie," she said softly, "who is this?" The girl pointed to the blonde woman. "That's you." I filled in the space. Evan entered from the kitchen just as Clara looked up, her eyes glistening. He froze for a moment, holding a plate of pancakes that had gone slightly too dark around the edges. "Rosie," he said gently, "that's very kind, but it's true," Rosie interrupted, her tone matter of fact. "She belongs here now." Evan sighed, setting down the plate. "You can't just decide that." Clara swallowed, still looking at the drawing. "She's very persuasive," she said quietly. Rosie tilted her head, examining Clara's face. "You don't have to cry about it," she said after a moment. "It's just a picture." That made Clara laugh through the ache in her chest. "I know," she said, "but it's the nicest picture anyone's ever given me." Satisfied, Rosie ran off to retrieve her stuffed rabbit from her room. Evan stood by the counter, rubbing a hand across the back of his neck. "She means well," he said. "I know," Clara replied. "It's just been a long time since anyone wanted me around without a reason." He hesitated before asking, "You were running from him, weren't you? The man in the alley?" Clara looked down at the table. "His name is Victor Lane. We were involved. He was my company's CFO." She took a long breath. "And my fiancé." Evan didn't speak. He simply waited, letting her words come when they were ready. "When my father died, I inherited the company. Victor convinced me to merge with his firm. He said it was for stability, for the shareholders." Her voice faltered. "It was for control. He started locking me out of my own accounts, and when I refused to sign over the rest, he—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "You saw how it ended." Evan's jaw tightened. "You should go to the police." "I can't," she said quietly. "The board would bury it. They'd protect him. It's easier for them if I just disappear." Rosie's voice carried from the other room. "Daddy, the rabbit wants breakfast too." Evan managed a faint smile. "Go easy on the syrup," he called back, then looked at Clara again. "You're not safe alone." "I wasn't safe surrounded by people either," she said. He studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You can stay here until you figure things out. No pressure." Clara hesitated. "You don't even know what I've done." "I don't need to," he said. "You're here now. That's enough." They ate breakfast quietly, Rosie chatting between bites about her school friends, her teacher's cat socks, and the spelling test she almost won. Clara listened with an attentiveness she hadn't realized she still possessed. The warmth of the room, the smell of syrup and burnt edges. The laughter that came without effort. It all felt unfamiliar and fragile, like holding something too precious to grip tightly. After breakfast, Rosie insisted on showing Clara her drawings. They sat on the rug, surrounded by crayons. Clara watched as the girl colored a field of flowers with wide, clumsy strokes. "You draw like you're happy," Clara said. Rosie nodded. "Daddy says colors make things better. When Mummy got sick, he told me to keep coloring so the world wouldn't turn grey." Clara's hand paused on the paper. "He's right," she said softly. Evan appeared in the doorway, watching them. "I see you've already been recruited," he said. Rosie looked up. "She's helping me draw sunshine." Evan smiled faintly. "She's good at that." Later that day, while Rosie napped, Clara tried to help with the dishes. She limped toward the sink, steadying herself on the counter. Evan turned from the stove and shook his head. "You're supposed to be resting." "I'm supposed to be useful," she replied. He set down the towel. "You are, just not in the way you think." Clara stared at the soap bubbles sliding down the porcelain. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The work you used to do?" He nodded. "Every day, but I don't miss what it took from me." She looked up. "What did it take?" He hesitated before answering. "Time. The kind you don't get back." Neither spoke after that. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that settled softly, like understanding. When evening came, the sky outside glowed faintly pink. Rosie woke and shuffled into the living room in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Story time?" she asked. Evan nodded. "Pick one." Rosie climbed onto the couch beside Clara, her small frame pressing against the older woman's arm. "You can read tonight," she said. "You have a nice voice." Clara smiled faintly. "I don't know any stories." "Make one up," Rosie said, handing her a book filled with empty pages and half-drawn sketches. "Start from here." Clara looked down at the unfinished drawings. "Once upon a time," she began slowly, "there was a woman who forgot who she was. Everyone told her she had everything, money, power, people who listened when she spoke, but she couldn't remember what it felt like to be seen." Rosie listened intently, eyes wide. "One night," Clara continued, "she got lost in the rain, and someone found her." "Who?" Rosie asked. "A man," Clara said softly, "and a little girl who colored sunshine." Evan, leaning against the wall, didn't move. He only listened as her voice carried through the room, low, uncertain, but full of something fragile and new. When the story ended, Rosie was already asleep, curled beneath Clara's arm. Evan crossed the room quietly, lifting his daughter and carrying her to bed. When he returned, Clara was still sitting on the couch, staring at the open notebook. "She fell asleep on me," she said quietly. "She does that when she feels safe," Evan replied. Clara looked up. "And what about you?" He thought for a moment. "I stopped feeling safe a long time ago," he said, "but lately it doesn't seem so far away." She smiled, small and tired. "Maybe we're both trying to remember what it feels like." Outside, the rain had started again, tapping gently against the windows. Clara leaned back, eyes half closed, and for the first time in years, the sound didn't make her feel trapped. It made her feel home. The weekend arrived with sunlight filtering through the dusty windows, scattering warmth across the small apartment. For the first time since Clara had arrived, the air felt light. The rain had given way to a clear blue sky, and somewhere down the street, a neighbor's radio played a cheerful old tune that drifted faintly through the open window. Rosie was the first to declare the day special. Standing in the middle of the living room in her polka-dot pajamas, she raised her hands and announced, "It's Pancake Day." Evan looked up from the newspaper spread across the table. "Since when?" he asked. "Since right now," Rosie replied firmly. "We haven't had pancakes since my birthday, and that was forever ago." Clara laughed from the couch, where she was propped up with her ankle resting on a pillow. "I think that's a valid argument," she said. "A girl needs pancakes." Evan gave a small smile. "All right, Pancake Day it is, but we're doing it my way, simple and slightly burnt." "I can help," Clara said, starting to move. He turned toward her immediately. "Not with that ankle." She gestured to the crutches leaning by the wall. "I can stand with those." Evan hesitated. "All right," he said finally. but only if you promise to let me handle the stove." Rosie clapped her hands. "Team pancakes!" The kitchen soon filled with noise, bowls clinking, milk splashing, and Rosie's excited commentary on every ingredient. Clara leaned against the counter, mixing flour with eggs under Rosie's supervision. "You're stirring too slow," the girl said, squinting. "It has to look like clouds." "Clouds?" Clara repeated. "Fluffy and a little lumpy," Rosie explained confidently. Clara laughed. "You might be the only person in the world who compares pancakes to weather." Evan flipped the first one onto a plate, slightly too dark around the edges. "There, perfect disaster," he said. Rosie wrinkled her nose. "Daddy, you burn them every time." "I call it flavor," he replied. The next few didn't go any better. The second pancake stuck to the pan, tearing down the middle. The third caught fire briefly, when Evan turned his head at the wrong moment. Clara instinctively grabbed a towel, waving it over the thin smoke rising from the stove. Evan coughed and laughed. "That one's yours," he said, sliding the charred result onto her plate. Clara smiled. "I've had worse dinners at five-star restaurants." Rosie giggled so hard she nearly dropped her fork. "These are dorky pancakes," she declared. "Dorky pancakes?" Evan asked. "Yeah," she said. "Not perfect, but good anyway." Evan and Clara exchanged a glance that lingered longer than either expected. The moment stretched quietly before Rosie's voice broke it again. "I like them this way," she said with a grin, "because dorky means real." Later they sat together at the small table, eating in the soft light pouring through the window. The pancakes were uneven, some raw in the middle, others blackened, but the laughter around the table made every imperfection feel right. Clara watched as Evan poured syrup onto Rosie's plate, his movements gentle, unhurried. She noticed how easily he smiled when the girl talked about her friends, about a teacher with cat socks, about how she'd told her classmates that her dad's friend might be her new mum. The fork paused halfway to Clara's mouth. She looked up quickly, meeting Evan's eyes. He didn't react, just poured more syrup and said, "Eat before it gets cold." Rosie, oblivious to the tension, kept talking. "I told them her hair looks like sunshine, and she laughs more now. That's how you know someone fits." Clara tried to breathe through the sudden tightness in her chest. "That's a very kind thing to say, Rosie." "It's true," Rosie said matter-of-factly. "You belong with us." Evan cleared his throat, focusing on the pancakes again. "Okay, Miss Philosopher," he said. "Less talking, more eating." Clara smiled faintly. "I think she just gave me a promotion." "Promotion?" Evan asked. "From guest to honorary family member," Clara said. Rosie clapped. "See, she gets it." After breakfast, the day unfolded gently. Rosie played with her crayons while Evan repaired a loose hinge on the cabinet. Clara watched, her leg resting on a stool, as sunlight danced across the floor. It was a small apartment, but it was filled with something she hadn't felt in years: ease. When Rosie left the room to change, Clara turned to Evan. "You don't have to let her get attached," she said quietly. "I'll be gone soon." He looked up from the screwdriver in his hand. "And go where?" "Anywhere," she said. "I've caused enough trouble." "You didn't cause the trouble," he said flatly. "You just stopped pretending it wasn't there." Clara opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. His tone wasn't sharp, just certain. The truth in it made her chest ache. "Rosie needs stability," she said after a moment. "So do you," Evan replied. The silence stretched between them again, gentle but charged. Outside, a car honked in the distance. Somewhere in the hallway, someone's radio played a slow song. Clara realized how rare it was for silence to feel like peace instead of punishment. That afternoon, Evan took Rosie to the park for a while. Clara stayed behind, resting her ankle. The apartment felt different without them, too quiet, too still. She walked slowly around the room, touching the small signs of their lives: Rosie's drawings, Evan's old jacket hanging by the door, a cracked mug by the sink. She caught sight of her reflection in the window and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Without the makeup, the tailored clothes, the armor of her old life, she looked ordinary. But somehow she didn't hate it. When the door opened an hour later, Rosie came bursting in holding a handful of daisies. "For you," she said, placing them in Clara's hands. They were growing by the swings. Clara smiled. They're beautiful. Evan set down a grocery bag. She insisted we bring them. Rosie climbed onto the couch beside Clara. Daddy said flowers grow better when you talk to them, she said. So I told these ones they're lucky because they get to stay here. Do you always talk to your flowers? Clara asked. Only the ones that matter, Rosie said. Evan chuckled softly. She gets that from her mother. Clara turned to him. She must have been kind. She was, he said quietly. The kind who believed small things could heal big hurts. Clara looked down at the flowers in her hands. Then she'd be proud of both of you. For the rest of the evening, the three of them sat together watching the sunset stain the city in orange and pink. Rosie fell asleep halfway through a story, her head resting on Clara's shoulder. Evan didn't move her. He just watched them for a long time, something unspoken flickering behind his eyes. When Clara looked up, he said quietly, "You look peaceful." "I feel peaceful," she said. "That's new." "Keep it," he said. "You've earned it." Outside, the last light faded from the skyline. Inside, the air was warm, the kind of warmth that doesn't come from heat, but from being exactly where you're meant to be. The farmhouse creaked with the quiet sounds of life, floorboards shifting, the kettle humming, wind brushing softly against the old wooden walls. Morning came with the smell of bread and coffee, and for once, Clara didn't wake in panic. She lay still beneath the thick quilt, listening to the low voices drifting up from the kitchen below. When she came downstairs, Evan was already seated at the small table, a mug in hand. His mother, Margaret, moved easily between the stove and the counter, her every motion patient and practiced. She looked up when she noticed Clara standing in the doorway. "Morning, dear," Margaret said warmly. "Sit down before the coffee gets cold." Clara obeyed, a little shy under the older woman's steady kindness. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You don't have to thank me," Margaret replied. "Kindness doesn't keep count." Rosie entered then, her curls wild, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She climbed into the chair beside Clara and grinned. "Grandma makes the best toast," she said proudly. Margaret winked. "That's because I cheat. Butter first, love second." Evan chuckled at that. "You've said that since I was 10, he told her. "And it's still true," Margaret said, sliding a plate toward him. Then she turned back to Clara. "Evan said you've had a rough time. You don't need to tell me anything you don't want to. Just rest. Let the quiet do some work for you." Clara nodded, grateful for the permission to say nothing. After breakfast, she stepped outside into the crisp air. The land stretched out before her, wide and golden, the scent of wet soil lingering after the rain. The world here moved slower. Every sound, the distant call of a bird, the creak of a fence, the crunch of gravel under her feet, felt deliberate. Evan joined her on the porch, leaning against one of the posts. "She likes you," he said, nodding toward the window where his mother's silhouette moved in the kitchen. Clara smiled faintly. "She doesn't even know me." "She knows enough," he said. "That's how she's always been. If you show up at her door hungry, she feeds you. If you look lost, she puts you to work until you stop thinking about it." Clara glanced toward the horizon. "That sounds peaceful." "It is," he said. "For a while." She turned to look at him. "You said you used to be a firefighter," she began. "Why did you stop?" Evan's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a small piece of metal from his pocket, a flattened badge, bent and scratched. "There was a fire," he said finally. "A small house, 1 story. I was the first on scene. A little girl was trapped inside. I got her out, but—" His voice trailed off. He stared at the badge in his hand. "She didn't make it." Clara didn't move. She only waited, the wind tugging softly at her hair. "I did everything right," he said quietly. "Followed the procedure, checked every room twice, but there was too much smoke, too much time." He exhaled. "After that, I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't walk into another fire knowing sometimes it isn't enough." Clara's voice was soft when she spoke. "You still carry it." "Every day," he said. "It doesn't get lighter. You just learn how to keep moving with it. She stepped closer, her expression gentle. That's what strength looks like, you know. Carrying what you can't fix. He met her eyes. You sound like someone who knows that feeling. She gave a small, rueful smile. Maybe I do. They stood there for a while in silence, watching the fields shimmer under the rising sun. The peace of the morning wrapped around them, not empty but full of things unspoken, loss, endurance, and the quiet hope that maybe healing didn't have to be loud. Later that afternoon, Rosie ran through the yard, her laughter chasing the wind. She stopped by the old fence, waving for them to come closer. "Look, there's a rabbit," she called, "and it's not stuffed this time." Evan laughed as he walked over, with Clara following more slowly. Rosie crouched near a patch of grass where a real rabbit sat perfectly still, its ears twitching. "It's so soft-looking," Rosie whispered. "Do you think it's scared?" "Maybe," Clara said. "It's hard to trust someone new." Rosie looked up. "Then we'll stay really still until it's not scared anymore." The three of them waited quietly, the sunlight pooling around them like warmth made visible. Eventually, the rabbit hopped closer, sniffing the air before darting back into the tall grass. Rosie grinned triumphantly. "See? It's not scared anymore." Clara smiled. "No, it's not." That evening, when the stars began to appear, Clara and Evan sat on the porch steps again. The night was clear, the sky vast and open. Rosie had long since fallen asleep, curled up in the spare room under one of Margaret's quilts. "I used to think I had everything," Clara said suddenly, her voice low. "A career people envied, a name that meant something. But it was all hollow. I didn't realize how much I'd traded just to keep it." Evan listened quietly. "They only saw my title," she continued. "Not me, not who I was when I stopped pretending." He nodded slowly. "I know what that's like. To be seen for what you do instead of who you are." She turned toward him. "Tell me." He took a deep breath. "After the fire, people treated me like a hero. Medals, speeches, all of it. They didn't understand that I didn't feel like one. I just felt empty. Everyone saw bravery. I saw failure." Clara reached for his hand, her fingers brushing his. "Maybe both can be true." He looked down at their joined hands. "Maybe," he said softly. They sat like that for a long time, the silence between them filled with something unspoken but solid. The night around them pulsed with the quiet rhythm of crickets, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and fell silent again. After a while, Clara said, "I think we both spent years running from things we couldn't change. Maybe that's why we ended up in the same place," he said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe." The farmhouse lights glowed warm behind them. From the open window came the faint sound of Margaret humming while she cleaned up the kitchen. Clara leaned back, her head resting lightly against the wooden post. For the first time in as long as she could remember, the quiet didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like belonging. Evan glanced sideways at her. "You know," he said, "I think you're stronger than you think." Clara let out a soft laugh. "That makes two of us." He smiled, and in that shared silence, something shifted. Something small but undeniable. It wasn't the loud, sweeping kind of love she used to read about. It was quieter, like the way fire still burns long after the flames die out, steady and unseen. When they finally went inside, the house was dark except for the faint glow from the hallway lamp. As Clara passed the mirror by the stairs, she caught her reflection once more. This time she didn't see the broken woman who'd stumbled into an alley or the polished CEO who'd built walls to keep out pain. She saw someone new, someone learning slowly, that maybe being seen didn't mean being perfect. She touched the small bracelet Rosie had woven for her earlier that day, a simple braid of colored threads. It wasn't gold or diamond, but it felt like the most valuable thing she'd ever owned. She smiled to herself and whispered into the quiet, "Maybe this is what real looks like." Upstairs, as she lay down to sleep, the night air smelled of pine and earth. From the next room came the faint sound of Rosie murmuring in her dreams, and somewhere downstairs Evan's footsteps moved softly across the floor, steady, familiar, safe. The fire that had once destroyed them both still lived inside, but now it burned differently. It wasn't the kind that consumed. It was the kind that kept them warm. The weeks passed quietly at the farmhouse, days blurred into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Early mornings filled with the smell of coffee and bread, afternoons in the garden where Rosie collected stones shaped like hearts, and evenings by the fire, where silence didn't need to be explained. For Clara, peace had become a kind of practice. Each sunrise reminded her that survival could look gentle. Her ankle was stronger now, and she walked without wincing, though Evan still offered his arm each time they crossed the uneven porch steps. She no longer refused it. Then one afternoon, a single letter arrived in the mail. Margaret handed it to her after lunch. "It came with the morning delivery," the older woman said. "Looks important." The envelope was thick, heavy with corporate precision, embossed with the familiar crest of her company, Monroe Systems International. Clara held it for a long moment before opening it. Evan watched from across the table. "You don't have to read it right now," he said. She nodded but tore it open anyway. Inside was a formal notice from the board of directors, requesting her attendance at an emergency shareholders meeting. Her name still appeared in the letterhead, listed as chairwoman and CEO. The words felt like ghosts. "They want me back," she said quietly. Evan's voice was measured. "Why now?" Clara scanned the text again. "Victor's been suspended pending investigation. Someone must have leaked the files I kept. They probably need me to clean it up." Margaret poured more coffee, her tone calm but knowing. "Sometimes people only remember your worth when their world starts to burn." Clara folded the letter slowly. "If I go back, it's not to fix their mess," she said. "It's to end it." Rosie ran in from outside just then, her shoes muddy, her hair tangled from the wind. "Are we going somewhere?" she asked eagerly. Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe," she said. "Somewhere I should have gone a long time ago." That night sleep didn't come easily. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, the faint creaks of the farmhouse echoing around her. Evan sat downstairs, the glow of the lamp outlining his profile as he read an old book. When she finally came down the stairs, he looked up without surprise. "You can't sleep either," he said. "Not really," she admitted. He closed the book, resting it on his knee. "You're thinking about tomorrow." "I'm thinking about what happens after," she said. "If I do this, it won't be quiet anymore. Not for me. Maybe not for you either." Evan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You don't owe them anything," he said. "I owe myself something," she replied softly. "A chance to walk out of that place on my own terms." He nodded once. "Then you walk out. Not because they call you back, but because you decide to leave." The next morning they drove back toward the city. Rosie stayed behind with Margaret, who promised to bake cookies and teach her how to make flower crowns. The road felt different this time, less like an escape, more like a reckoning. Clara stared out the window as the skyline came into view, glass towers catching the sunlight like polished memories. "It looks smaller than I remember," she said quietly. "Maybe you just got bigger," Evan replied. By the time they reached the headquarters building, reporters were already gathered near the entrance. Cameras clicked, microphones lifted. Clara stepped out of the truck with her chin raised, her pace steady despite the limp that still lingered. The polished marble floors reflected her image back at her as she walked through the lobby, a reflection no longer dressed for perfection but for truth. She entered the boardroom without hesitation. The air was cold and sterile, the same as she'd left it. Men and women in suits whispered to each other, their voices low but sharp. At the front of the room, Victor Lane stood flanked by two attorneys, his usual confidence thinned into arrogance held by thread. "Miss Monroe," he said, his tone deliberately calm. "How unexpected. I assumed you'd finally accepted your place away from all this." "I did," she said, "and that's exactly why I came back." A murmur spread across the room. She walked to the center, placing a small folder on the polished table. "I came to finish this the right way." Victor smirked. "You really think anyone here will believe you over me?" She met his gaze steadily. "I don't need them to believe. I just need them to see." With a single motion, she opened her laptop and connected it to the projector. The large screen behind her came alive. Emails, contracts, financial records, all pointing to the fraudulent schemes Victor had orchestrated. The silence that followed was absolute. "Every number here is traceable," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "Every lie signed in your name. You used my company to build your empire. But that ends today." Victor's composure cracked. "This is reckless," he snapped. "You have no idea what this could cost you." "I do," she said evenly. "And I'm ready to pay it." The older woman at the end of the table, Eleanor Shaw, one of her earliest mentors, leaned forward. "Clara," she said softly, "why walk away now when you could win?" "Because winning in their world means losing yourself," Clara said, "and I'm done trading pieces of myself for power." She pulled out one last document and placed it on the table. "This is my resignation," she said, "effective immediately. I'm relinquishing my position, my shares, and every last thread of control you ever thought you had over me." The room remained silent, every eye fixed on her. Victor's face flushed red. "You'll regret this," he said through gritted teeth. "You're throwing away everything." Clara held his gaze. "No," she said quietly. "I'm walking away from what was never mine to begin with." She gathered her folder and laptop, then turned to leave. No one stopped her. Not this time. When she reached the elevator, Evan was waiting just outside the glass doors. He hadn't gone in, but he'd stayed close enough to make sure she wasn't alone. She stepped into the cool air of the lobby and let out a long breath. He looked at her and asked simply, "Was it worth it?" She nodded. Every second. Outside, the sun was setting behind the skyscrapers, staining the city gold. As they walked toward the truck, she said, "I thought this place made me powerful, but it was just noise. I don't need to be seen by millions anymore. I just want to be seen by the people who matter." Evan gave a small, understanding nod. "Then let's go home." The drive back felt lighter. When they reached the farmhouse again, the scent of fresh bread and laughter met them before they even stepped inside. Rosie came running out of the door, her hands covered in flour. "You're back," she shouted. "Grandma let me make cookies and I didn't burn any, well, maybe one." Clara laughed as the girl hugged her tightly. "That's still better than my cooking record." Rosie stepped back and looked at her closely. "You look different," she said. "How so?" Clara asked. "Like you're not carrying something heavy anymore," Rosie said simply. "Like you can breathe." Evan smiled at that, and Clara felt her throat tighten. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think I finally can." Later that evening, they sat together on the porch as twilight deepened. Fireflies blinked in the distance, and the air smelled of rain and soil. Evan handed her a cup of tea. "You did what you needed to do," he said. "I did," she replied. "And for the first time, I didn't do it to prove anything. I just did it to be free." He studied her face for a moment, then said quietly, "You look like yourself again." Clara smiled faintly. "I think I finally know who that is." The porch light flickered, and Rosie's laughter floated from inside as Margaret helped her wash cookie dough from her hands. Clara looked out over the darkening fields, the stars beginning to appear. "Evan," she said softly, "thank you for not walking away when I was at my worst." He shook his head. "You don't thank someone for standing beside you," he said. "You just stay when it's your turn." She met his eyes and said, "Then I'm staying." The night wrapped around them gently, the world hushed and alive. In that quiet, between the hum of crickets and the soft clink of teacups, Clara Hale finally understood what it meant to belong, not to a company, not to a legacy, but to a life she had chosen herself. The next morning, sunlight spilled gently through the farmhouse windows, scattering across the wooden floors in quiet warmth. Clara woke to the faint sound of laughter drifting from outside. She stood, still half in dreams, and followed it through the kitchen door onto the porch. In the garden beyond the fence, Evan and Rosie were crouched in the soil. Evan wore his faded work shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, while Rosie sat cross-legged beside a small patch of earth, her curls bouncing as she worked. Her hands were covered in dirt, but her smile was radiant. When Rosie saw Clara at the porch, she waved enthusiastically. "We're planting new flowers today," she called. "This one's going to be orange. Daddy says you can pick the next one." Clara stepped down slowly, the grass cool beneath her bare feet. "Then I choose yellow," she said, kneeling beside them. "It's the color of hope." Evan glanced at her, sunlight catching the edges of his hair. "Good choice," he said. "We could use more of that around here." Rosie nodded seriously. "And love," she added. "Flowers grow better when they have love." Evan smiled faintly. "That's true, sweetheart." They worked together for hours, turning the soil, planting seeds, watering each row. The quiet hum of the world around them, the buzz of bees, the soft rustle of birch leaves, felt almost sacred. Clara's hands were streaked with dirt, her knees sore, but she didn't care. Each motion grounded her. Each touch of the soil felt like claiming something new. At one point, Rosie looked up and said, "We should name the garden." Evan wiped his hands on his jeans. "You've got any ideas?" Rosie thought for a moment, tapping her chin. "The Lily Garden," she said proudly. "Because lilies mean rebirth, right? Miss Harper at school said so." Clara smiled, caught off guard by the choice. "That's beautiful," she said. "The Lily Garden." Rosie's grin widened. "Then it's decided." By noon, the sun had climbed high, and the three of them sat under the old oak tree drinking lemonade that Margaret had brought out in mason jars. The air shimmered with heat, and for the first time in years, Clara felt the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from fear or pressure. It came from living. Evan set his glass down and said, "You know, we could turn this into something more. A community garden, maybe. Somewhere people could come when they need a place to start over." Clara tilted her head. "You mean like a project?" "More like a promise," he said. "To give people what we both needed when we lost everything." She looked at him for a long moment. "You really think something that small could change anything?" He nodded. "Small things are the only ones that ever do." That night, after Rosie had fallen asleep, Clara sat at the table with her laptop open. The faint glow of the screen lit her face as she typed, fingers moving slowly but with purpose. Evan entered quietly, drying his hands with a towel. "Working on something?" he asked. She looked up. "I'm drafting a plan. A non-profit organization built around what we talked about. A place for women like me, for anyone who's been broken by the kind of power that pretends to protect them." He leaned against the counter. "You already have a name for it, don't you?" Clara nodded. "The Lily House." He smiled slightly. "Of course you do." She laughed softly. "Rosie inspired it. She always does." Over the next few weeks, the idea began to take shape. They reached out to local shelters, designed a simple website, and started raising small donations. Margaret baked bread for every community meeting, insisting that kindness should always be served warm. Rosie helped paint signs, her tiny hands leaving colorful fingerprints on everything she touched. One afternoon, Clara was giving a small speech at the town hall, a gathering of neighbors and volunteers curious about the project. She stood at the front of the room, her voice clear and steady. "No one should have to earn safety," she said. "No one should have to beg for kindness. The world has enough people who build walls. It's time to build doors instead." When the room erupted in quiet applause, Clara caught sight of Evan at the back, watching her with a look she couldn't quite name, something between admiration and peace. Later that evening, back at the farmhouse, she found him sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. The stars above were sharp and bright, and the air smelled faintly of rain again. She sat beside him without a word. "You were good today," he said after a moment. "I was terrified," she admitted. He chuckled. "Didn't show." She smiled. "You think this will really work? The Lily House?" "I think it already has," he said. "Look around. You're changing things." She followed his gaze to the window, where Rosie's latest drawing was taped to the glass. A family standing in a field of flowers, smiling beneath a painted sun. Clara's throat tightened as she whispered, "She drew us again." Evan nodded. "Seems like we're official now." She laughed quietly, the sound soft as breath. Then I guess I should get used to it. The night grew cooler. Evan set his cup down and reached into his pocket. I have something for you, he said. Clara turned to him, curious. What is it? He opened his hand to reveal a small bracelet made of multicolored threads. It was uneven, clearly handmade, but woven with care. Rosie made it, he said. She calls it a commitment bracelet. Said it's not a wedding ring, but she was wondering if maybe you'd want to be an unofficial mom first. Clara's laugh caught halfway to a sob. She took the bracelet gently, running her thumb across the uneven knots. It's beautiful, she said. He smiled. It's Rosie's way of saying you belong here, ours too. Clara slipped it onto her wrist. It fits, she said softly. Perfectly. Evan leaned back, watching her. I told her you'd say that. The silence between them was warm, filled with the quiet hum of night insects and the faint flicker of light from inside the house. Clara looked down at the bracelet again. For the first time in my life, she said, I feel like I've been chosen just for being me. Evan reached out, his fingers brushing hers. You don't have to be anything else, he said. They sat there long after the stars had brightened overhead, their hands intertwined on the porch railing. In the distance, the garden shimmered faintly under the moonlight, the first sprouts breaking through the soil. Life growing quietly in the dark. Days turned into weeks. The lily house began to bloom, both in name and in spirit. Women arrived, some scared, some angry, all searching for a new beginning. Clara welcomed each one with the same quiet assurance that Evan had once shown her. You can stay. It's okay. One morning, Rosie burst through the door, waving a fresh drawing in her hand. Look, she said excitedly. It's us planting flowers. It's our forever garden. Clara knelt down, examining the picture. 3 stick figures, one tall man, one little girl, and one woman with golden hair, all surrounded by colorful flowers. It's beautiful, she said, kissing Rosie's cheek. Do you like it? Rosie asked, beaming. Because I'm not erasing you later. Clara felt her throat tighten again. I love it, she said, more than anything. Evan appeared at the doorway, smiling as he watched them. She's going to fill this house with drawings, he said. Good, Clara replied. That's exactly what it needs. That night, as the 3 of them sat together on the couch, the hum of the city faint through the open window, the smell of cookies cooling on the counter, Clara felt something she hadn't known she'd been missing. Not perfection, not certainty, just peace. Rosie leaned against her, sleepy-eyed, and whispered, You'll stay here forever, right? Clara brushed a strand of hair from the girl's forehead. If you ever need me, she said softly, I'll always be here. Evan looked at her then, his expression quiet and full. No grand declarations, no promises written in gold, just understanding. And in that silence, filled with the sound of the garden outside and the steady rhythm of a child's breathing, Clara finally believed in something again. Not fate, not luck, just love. Simple, chosen, and real. Spring arrived slowly, the way healing does. The snow melted from the fields, and the garden they'd planted together came alive again. Green shoots pushing through the soil, trembling at the edge of new life. The farmhouse was busier now. The lily house had grown beyond the small rooms and the worn porch. Women came every week to help, to learn, to rest. Some stayed for days, some for months. No one ever left the same. Clara stood by the kitchen window that morning, watching as 2 volunteers laughed while carrying fresh soil toward the garden. Behind them, Rosie ran ahead with a watering can nearly her size, her laughter floating through the open air like music. Evan entered from the porch, brushing dust from his hands. We're going to need another row, he said. The tulips are taking over. Clara turned to him, smiling. I told you planting them so close together would do that. He shrugged lightly. I didn't think they'd listen, she laughed quietly. They always listen, that's why they grow. Evan leaned against the counter, his gaze soft. You've changed a lot, you know. Clara looked out the window again. Maybe I've just gone back to who I was before the noise. Do you ever miss it? He asked. The city, the rush. She considered it for a moment. Sometimes, she admitted, but it feels like remembering someone else's life, like reading about a stranger and realizing you used to know them." He nodded. "I get that." The morning stretched on. Rosie came in with dirt on her cheeks and an orange tulip in her hand. "For you," she said, holding it out to Clara. "Because it's the first one that bloomed." Clara crouched down to take it. "It's beautiful," she said. "It means joy," Rosie added proudly. "I looked it up in Grandma's flower book." "Then I'll keep it forever," Clara said, tucking the tulip behind her ear. Rosie smiled, satisfied, before running off again. When she was gone, Clara turned to Evan. "Do you realize she's happier now than she's ever been?" "I do," he said. "So am I." They shared a quiet look that said everything words couldn't. The kind of understanding that grows not from grand gestures, but from showing up every day. Later that afternoon, Clara sat outside beneath the oak tree, reviewing the latest reports for the Lily House. Donations were steady, new volunteers had joined, and a small article had been published in a local newspaper calling the project "A Sanctuary Born from Silence." She folded the clipping and placed it beside her. Evan approached with 2 glasses of lemonade and handed her one. "You're famous again," he said, sitting beside her. "Not the same kind of famous," she replied. "And that's exactly why it feels right," he nodded. "You're building something that lasts." "I hope so," she said. "This time it's not about numbers, it's about faces." He looked toward the garden where Rosie was helping another woman plant herbs. "You gave them something to believe in." She smiled faintly. "You gave me something to believe in first." Evening fell slowly, painting the fields in gold. The women who had come to help were packing up, laughter echoing as they said their goodbyes. Rosie chased a butterfly near the fence, her small voice bright against the quiet. Margaret called from the porch, "Dinner's ready and no skipping the vegetables this time." Rosie shouted back, "Only if you made dessert." "Of course I did," Margaret replied, her tone teasing. Clara stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. "Come on," she said to Evan. "We don't want to be late for Grandma's dessert." He smiled. "You're part of that we now, you know." "I know," she said, "and it still surprises me." They walked back together, the scent of roasted vegetables and bread spilling through the open door. Inside, the table was set, candles flickering in glass jars, Rosie humming as she carried plates far too big for her hands. They ate, laughed, shared stories. When the dishes were cleared and Rosie was tucked into bed, the house grew quiet again. Clara found Evan on the porch, leaning against the railing, looking out over the dark fields. The moon was bright tonight, silvering the tops of the trees. She joined him, her voice low. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" He glanced at her. "You mean after all this?" "Yes," she said. "After the garden, after the Lily House. What happens when we've helped everyone we can?" He smiled faintly. "Then we start again. Someone else will need it." She nodded slowly. "That sounds like a good way to live." For a while they just stood there, listening to the sounds of the night, the crickets, the rustle of wind through the grass, the soft creak of the porch boards beneath their feet. Then Evan said quietly, "You know, Rosie asked me something today." "What did she ask?" Clara said. "She wanted to know if forever is real." Clara looked at him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her forever isn't a time," he said. "It's a choice." She was silent for a long moment before replying. "Then I choose it," she said, "not because it's easy, but because it feels true." He turned toward her, the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. "Then so do I." They didn't need to say more. The air between them carried everything that mattered. Clara reached for his hand, and he met hers halfway, their fingers intertwining like roots beneath the soil. The next morning came with soft rain. The garden shimmered under the droplets, the tulips bending gently under the weight of the water. Clara stepped outside with an umbrella, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. She walked between the rows, her fingertips grazing the leaves, the petals, the fragile signs of life she had helped nurture. Rosie joined her, holding a smaller umbrella patterned with stars. "Daddy says the rain makes everything grow faster," she said. "He's right," Clara replied. "Rain reminds the earth to start again." Rosie nodded, thoughtful. "Then maybe people need rain too." Clara smiled. "Maybe we do." They stood there together, the rain falling softly around them, the world quiet except for the gentle sound of drops on soil. Evan appeared at the porch, waving them in. "Breakfast is ready," he called, "and if you're not quick, Rosie's pancakes are going to vanish." Rosie giggled and started running toward the house. "I made extra this time," she shouted. Clara followed, pausing at the edge of the garden. The rain touched her face, cool and clean. She looked back at the rows of flowers swaying in the breeze, yellow, orange, pink, white, and felt something deep inside settle into place. The chaos, the fear, the endless noise that had once filled her life had all quieted into this. A single, steady heartbeat shared with people who saw her not for what she was, but for who she had become. As she stepped inside, Evan handed her a towel. "You're soaked," he said, smiling. She took it, brushing the rain from her hair. "I don't mind," she said. "It feels like the world's washing everything clean." He watched her for a moment before saying softly, "Then let it." They sat down at the table together, Rosie chattering about her garden plans, Margaret teasing Evan about his overcooked eggs. The house buzzed with the kind of warmth that doesn't come from fire but from belonging. When breakfast was over, Rosie drew another picture, this one of the lily garden, blooming under a bright sun, with 3 figures standing hand in hand. She held it up proudly. "See?" she said. "Now it's really forever." Clara met Evan's eyes and said quietly, "She's right." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Then let's keep it that way." Outside, the garden swayed gently in the wind. Inside, laughter filled the room. And in that moment, without speeches or promises or grand gestures, Clara Hale knew she had found what she had been searching for all along. A life that grew quietly, beautifully, like a bloom that never needed to prove its worth.